CLC Action Plan, October 2022, following Nurse Z. Blackie. During the mock survey, the below 4 issues were cited: infection control, inhaler use, care plans, noting that the care given must match the care plan, and finally tube feedings. The nurse must first check for placement before starting the tube feeding. We will be following Nurse Z. Blackie and CNA Clement as they provide care for veterans in the CLC. Please note any unlicensed personnel, such as CNAs or health techs, may fast forward through the sections on inhaler administration as well as tube feeding placement. As Nurse Z. Blackie and CNA Clement begin their day, we'll start with our very first patient, Mrs. Smith. Mrs. Smith is awake and is requesting to be washed up and transferred into her wheelchair. She will need to use the lift to get into the chair. Nurse Z. Blackie knows that Mrs. Smith likes to be in the dining hall at 8 a.m. sharp, and it is already 7:30. She rushes into Mrs. Smith's room, helps her complete a full bed bath using the same water and washcloth. Because she is in a rush, she also does not change her gloves. Nurse Z. Blackie requests CNA Clement help put a sling underneath Mrs. Smith. They find a sling in the patient's wheelchair. Once this is underneath the patient, they safely transfer her into the wheelchair and transport her down to the dining hall. In the case of Mrs. Smith, what did the nurse do wrong? The first error was improper hand hygiene. The second was not changing the towel nor gloves while providing patient care. And the last error was not disinfecting the sling. The proper procedure would have been for the nurse as well as the CNA to sanitize hands when entering the patient's room. It's also important to remember to wash hands in between cares or when they are visibly soiled. Wet hands, apply soap, develop a good lather, and scrub them together rigorously for 20 seconds. Gloves and towels should be changed throughout the process. When wearing gloves, when providing patient care, be sure to practice hand hygiene and change gloves before moving on to a different task. For example, after performing ADLs or helping a veteran with ADLs, practice hand hygiene after removing gloves, and then put on new gloves before obtaining a finger stick. Nurse Zablocki is starting her med pass. She first goes into the room of Mr. Green. Mr. Green is requesting his PRN inhaler. This time, Nurse Zablocki does sanitize her hand. She uses 2 patient identifiers, practice the 6 rites of medication before administering the inhaler, as well as assessing Mr. Green's breath sounds. She does provide him with his inhaler. She has him take 2 puffs with a spacer with no breaks in between the 2 puffs. In the case of Mr. Green and the inhaler, what did the nurse do wrong? She did not wait at least 1 minute in between inhalations from the inhaler. When administering an inhaler or instructing a patient to self-administer, the nurse always has to wait in between puffs, as well as instructing the patient to inhale deeply and to hold for about 10 seconds. It's also very important to use a spacer when applicable. After having his inhaler, Mr. Green shares with Nurse Zablocki that he would like to try aromatherapy for his insomnia. He states he only likes lavender. He also requests to have a warm blanket at bedtime each night. Because Mr. Green's requests are new, they need to be updated in his care plan. Nurse Zablocki would need to enter in the care plan that Mr. Green would like aromatherapy as well as warm blankets before he goes to bed at night. CNAs and health techs are responsible for helping to implement the care plan. In this case, it would be making sure Mr. Green has lavender and a warm blanket. CNAs and health techs should report to the nurses if any portion of the care plan has changed or is not happening. For instance, in the case of Mr. Green, if he states that he no longer likes lavender, but instead would like mandarin, the CNA or health tech should report that to the nurse. The care given has to match the care plan. Mrs. Navy's G-tube. It is time for Mrs. Navy's tube feeding, but she is sound asleep. Nurse Zablocki briefly wakes up Mrs. Navy to confirm her identity using two patient identifiers and practicing the 6 rites of medication before Mrs. Navy falls asleep again. She doesn't want to continue to disrupt the patient, so she quickly connects and starts the tube feeding. In the case of Mrs. Navy and the G-tube, what did the nurse do wrong? What is the issue? In this case, the issue is that the nurse did not check for tube placement before starting the tube feeding. In summary, practice proper infection control. This includes hand hygiene, changing washcloths and gloves during cares, sanitizing equipment such as slings, as this is essential to prevent spreading disease. One should have a patient wait in between inhalations when using an inhaler. Regarding care plans, patient care must match what is stated in the care plan. And finally, before starting tube feeding, be sure to check for placement. To receive credit, please be sure to go back into the announcement and check the anti-station statement stating that you have watched the full video. The one exception is for unlicensed personnel. Unlicensed personnel such as CNAs, NAs, or health techs could fast forward through the tube feeding section as well as the albuterol administration section. Thank you, and thank you for all the care that you give our veterans.